That's an interesting question. And that was definitely one of those like, Marvel would never do this.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to meet you, man. I appreciate you taking the time to chat.
You too. It's a good collection you got back there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was a product of the Blockbuster generation. I worked there for 5 years. Like, it's the best job I've ever had. And when it was sadly closing down, that's kind of where that began. I see you got stuff behind you there, but I'm assuming you're a bit of a physical media collector yourself as well.
I mean, not, yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
I don't have that much stuff.
It's a scary amount of stuff. I do want to kind of get in before we start. I really wanted to chat to you. I'm a genuinely big fan of your work because I do have to say in that collection are three movies that
Hey,
I like genuinely, and I used to have Gamer in there as well, but I lent it to someone and it never came back. And just
let him have it. Just let him
let have it. Well, I'll defend it. I'll defend that movie. But I just wanted to say before we get started, like I saw those movies as like a late teen, and they were genuinely formative in like my love for what I guess you guys would describe you and Mark as punk rock cinema. Like I genuinely love those fucking movies, man. So thank you so much for taking the time to
have it.
chat.
That was true grindhouse. It was true grindhouse.
Literal true grindhouse, the grindhouse of the 21st century, and I love that. So and yeah, I really fought to try and chat with you about Hellboy as well. So thanks for taking the time, man. But
Good.
I guess I'll kick off with the first thing that stood out to me about the Crooked Man is that sudden drop of the title card. I love how the movie starts just kind of punching you in the face with that Hellboy, the Crooked Man title card. So I'm curious to know how much thought goes into that, whether that's a decision you make before the edit or as you're sort of putting the film together. Do you go, okay, this is how I kind of want to start the film?
Uh, that particular sometimes title sequences are planned out.
Mm,
This particular one was not. We just found it in post, and I actually it's funny because like on this movie, I did something that I haven't done since Crank
mm.
1 and 2, which is I designed all the titles myself at home.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, because they kind of ran out of money, and they had some clowns that were gonna do it, and I saw what they were doing, and I was like, oh, I guess I gotta dust off my dust off my my After Effects and Photoshop skills again, and I really wanted it to have that Hammer horror kind of
Mm,
like 70s good feeling kind of folk horror thing going on. I didn't want it
mm,
to feel slick and polished and
mm.
like a normal comic book movie or a normal Hellboy movie or just
Mm.
like a normal movie.
I guess this like sets the vibe right for what we're about to experience in that folk horror, that
Yeah,
feel sense.
I love that just dropping right in. And then the whole idea at the beginning of the movie with the whole thing on the train is that
Mm,
these guys are they're headed off on some mission we don't know to some other movie. More of
yeah.
a more of the kind of movie we would expect. But the train derails and then they get dumped into this other movie.
I love the idea of that, and it feels like they're coming from another one as well. This is like like you said, derailing in from one journey to another. I think it's awesome. So, obviously, the idea of Hellboy or the character itself is that you have an actor who is in these iconic prosthetics. It's makeup that we know, whether it's from the comic or the previous films. And I'm curious to know what those characteristics of Jack were that outside of any physicality sort of made him the Hellboy that was right for this, knowing that he was going to be covered in this iconic costume. What was he bringing to the role that you were looking for to bring out this Hellboy to life?
Well, he kind of walks around as Hellboy. You could really just like put a couple of horns on him and he's that guy. When he did his audition, the first thing he did was smoke a cigarette and put it out on his tongue and eat it and then go into the dialogue. I was like, yeah, this kind of feels like Hellboy. So that's part of it. Definitely there is the physicality and there is the swag and there is the sort of attitude, right? But this is like a younger Hellboy,
Yeah.
this movie set in the late 50s and Hellboy's like an angry young man. He's just trying to find his way in the world and that kind of thing. And I think one of the aspects of Hellboy that's really important to me, as a character, I know to Mike Mignola as well, is this idea that like all that wisecracking and sarcasm and all that, that's just surface.
Sure.
That's how he projects to cover up what's actually like a lot of pain inside. This is a guy who carries around a lot of weight and gravity, and anxiety and anxiousness, sort of like
Yeah, yeah.
he's got a lot of doubts in himself. and like what his place is in the world and all that. So with a guy like Kessie, you can tell he's a young dude, but he's really lived, man. You could
Yeah,
tell that guy carries around a lot of weight. He's got a lot of gravity as a person,
sure.
and he has that sarcastic wit. But you can see in his eyes that there's something behind it. So to me, he was just like, I mean, this is the guy, because 90% of directing actors is just
Mm.
casting right.
Right.
If you cast wrong, you can do the most A plus greatest directing in your life, and it just kind of gets it to okay.
Mm.
Yeah, but if you cast right, you can be a complete idiot and still get a great performance. So to me, there were a lot of names that came up for this. There were bigger names,
Sure.
uh, but I knew we didn't have a lot of time. I knew we didn't have a lot of money,
Mm.
and so it was like I just really felt it was important to get a guy who felt right, who really felt like Hellboy. And then in terms of the prosthetics, to sort of like strive to make it as transparent as possible. Like a
Right.
problem, I think in the last film they did with David Harbour. David Harbour's a very charismatic actor
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
and people love him, but he had so much shit over him. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, it was
it
thick
looked
on
like
him.
a guy
Yeah.
in a mask.
Yeah, yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
you couldn't see David Harbour. I wouldn't have been able, his mother couldn't tell you that that was David Harbour. It didn't
Yeah.
look like him. It didn't sound like him. It didn't feel like him. I wasn't seeing any of his personality shining through. So
Mm.
on this one, I wanted to make sure, working with the prosthetics guys who were great, KM Effects in the UK. You want to give them a shout out.
Yeah, yeah.
Our mandate from the beginning was like, let's make this as transparent as possible because I want to put the camera really close to him and I really want to see his eyes and I want to see his emotion and I want to see his personality come through as much as possible.
I think it does. I think that transparent is a really good word to describe it. I think especially when you see, especially when he has those moments where you feel that weight of him. It really comes across through them, especially those eyes, man. Jack's got those eyes that kind of that 1,000 yard stare at times, man.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly the 1950s sort of setting of the film, and I'm really curious to know. Obviously, as I said earlier, I'm such a fan of like the visual aesthetic and style of your films, and we get to see a bit of that sort of punk rock aesthetic come through. I'm curious to know how you sort of combine that with not just a 1950s like folk horror aesthetic, but kind of this like pre-established Hellboy world. What was that process like of like bringing your own visual spin on something that kind of has established things about it already?
Well, I first of all, we didn't reference the other movies at all because
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just feel like, those are $200 million
yeah,
space operas. It's like it's just like a completely different world. Like we
mm,
couldn't evoke that if we wanted to.
mm,
And this is Mike Mignola's favorite Hellboy story. It's taken
right,
directly from his comic, and this is the story he wanted to tell. And it's a folk horror story. It's a
yeah,
contained folk horror story. So I didn't reference any of the movies. I just referenced the comics.
yeah,
And so the formalism of it, as opposed to like the more punk rocky stuff I've done,
mm.
believe me, if you were behind the scenes, you would see the punk rock ethic in full swing. But in terms of what's in front of the camera, I feel that the comic book tells you what it wants to be. It wants to be
Sure.
more formal. It wants to be sort of a throwback. It wants to be more organic. And just in keeping with that world. And you could picture this same actor, this same take on the character. You could picture him sort of moving gradually through the eras.
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
Whereas in the 60s it would be more like a 60s aesthetic, and the 70s more like a 70s aesthetic. And finally, when he gets up to the 90s, then it would look like Crank, you know. But it's like you have to get there. So that,
yeah,
that
yeah,
that was the approach. The approach was just not to be referential to any of the other films, but really just take a fresh look at the character straight from the pages,
yeah.
straight
At
from,
this
straight from Mike's work.
that specific point in his life too has that. Yeah, it's like how our lives changed. It's we all start at a certain point. I'm curious to know what that collaboration was like with Mike on the script as well, because obviously, like you just said, it's his favorite Hellboy story. And if I read correctly, he worked on the screenplay or had some sort of input into it as well. What's that? Those conversations and collaboration look like, and the ideas of interpretation and adaptation. How much were you wanting to keep as close as possible to the story, and how much did you kind of in the screenplay at least sort of interpret things in your own way and work on Mike with that?
Well, it was great. I mean, like, so I have a lot of respect for original creators.
Yeah,
I think it's 1,000 times harder to invent something than it is to refine it.
yeah,
And to me, Mike Mignola is he's a true genius of the medium. There's not many guys, I can't really think of anybody who's done what he's done, come up with this sort of zeitgeist household name character and a whole universe around him without being affiliated with Marvel or DC, just one
Yeah,
guy's brain as an independent. That's amazing, right?
yeah,
So, and he wrote the first draft. So when I came in, I was really excited to be like, okay, this is great because now I know what we're doing. What we're doing is we're trying to make Mike's vision of Hellboy come alive for the first time, really.
yeah, yeah.
And but it was funny because when I read the draft that he wrote with Chris Golden, there were a lot of things in it that compromises and changes that they had made from the original script that I think they did in it because they felt they had to make it more of like a movie. And it's like they'll
Right.
never let
Yeah.
us do this because it's Hollywood. So for example, they had moved it to contemporary, so there were like cell phones and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Right.
and when I read the draft, I was like, I was like, you guys didn't need to do this.
No.
So when I did my pass,
Mm.
I actually didn't use their draft as a launching point, even though it was Mike, because I
Yeah.
said, I want to go back to the comic book. And actually, I'm going to change it a lot. I told Mike, I'm going to change a lot. I'm going to change this draft a lot, but you're going to love the changes because it's going way back all the way to what you originally did, you
Sweet.
know? So then I just did a whole pass on the thing where I basically just took out all the new stuff and just brought everything back to the original as much as I could.
That's awesome. And
And and
yeah,
and
yeah.
then when he read it, he was like, "Ah, man, it's so different." He's like, "But I like it." I'm like, "I knew you would. I knew you would."
It's I think just throwing it into that folk horror, like that witches and all that stuff, like it's all stuff that works in the world, but it's like I said, it's that new thing that we haven't seen as film audiences anyway. I'd love to
It's
ask
such
if,
a
oh yeah.
he has such like a dry um such a dry wit to his dialogue. Like
Yeah, oh god, yeah.
there's a line in the movie that's straight from the comic book where the Reverend is saying like, "Yeah, used to be a lot of normal people lived around here too, but nowadays it's mostly just witches." That's just a straight verbatim line from the comic book. It's just so good, man.
It hits so well. It hits so well.
Yeah.
I'd love to ask about filming action violence versus horror violence. Like I don't know if the technicalities of actually behind the scenes are quite similar, but I'm curious to know how your approach goes from say a insane chase or shootout scene in Crank to some of the body horror and violence we get in this film, which is awesome and very Hellboy like. I'm curious to know sort of whether your approach to the directing changes or the visual aspects of it change. Sort of, is there a difference, I guess, between action violence and horror violence from a director's point of view?
That's an interesting question. I don't, I mean, you know, the palette of the movie is different,
Sure. Yeah.
so it's like you want to put a lot of black ink on the screen,
Mm.
and make it really shadowy and things coming out of the shadows and things that are you can't quite see in the corners of the frames and things like that.
Yeah.
But I would kind of do a lot of that stuff in action anyway. I kind of feel like it's the same. I
That's
feel like
awesome.
it's the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking of the scene at the end where Crooked Man and Hellboy are sort of face to face, and he's just kind of telling him exactly what he's going to do to him, all the
Yeah.
nasty things, and there's flies buzzing around and choking him and all this stuff, and there's like some horrific stuff that's happening, and of course, Crooked Man. So I was thinking like, well, that's different than what I would do in an action scene, isn't it?
Mm.
But then I thought like. It's not that much different from Jason Statham falling out of the helicopter with his face to face. So, it's still, you still have the two guys
Yeah.
that hate each other the most, right in each other's face, just letting each other know exactly how they feel about him. It's like some of these things are just, yeah, it just kind of feels the same.
Just that different palette, right? Yeah. That's all. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Just like different mood
Sure.
in general.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And,
fascinating.
but the action in particular, yeah, it feels pretty similar. In this movie, it was a lot more formal in general.
Yeah.
I tried to stay away from handheld as much as I could.
Mm.
Just wanted to feel more of its time.
Yeah.
Um, but that's less of a horror thing and more of just a period piece kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of I mean, the big zombie fight in the church. I mean, that could have been
Yeah.
any action scene.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. Brian, I'm getting close to time here. I know you have more interviews after this. I do want to ask, if you don't mind, let me know sort of how the sausage was made. That effect where the raccoon comes in the window and makes its way into a lifeless body. That was one of the most disturbing, creepiest, but it looked incredible, and I'm assuming it was practical.
Yeah.
How did you pull that? Was that prosthetics? Was that how did you pull that off? It's
Yeah,
so
yeah. I
fucking
mean that
disturbing.
it was pretty disturbing to shoot. Let me tell
I
you.
could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of those things in the comic book. That scene is in the comic just like that, and you
Yeah.
read it on the page, and you think like, wow, well, that could either be a really bad CGI scene,
Mm,
or we could do it like the Clive Barker way, and
yeah.
with a bunch of silicone and lube, and just a great performance by an actor. And so that's how we did it. And I tell you, I've the woman who plays Cora,
Mm,
Hannah Margetson, is so amazing. And when I watch that thing, we've seen it a million times as we're editing it. I still, I almost can't spot the handoff where it goes from prosthetic to human, and it's a straight cut. There's no CG at all. It's only performance and cuts, but it's hard for me to find the moment when it hands over because it just kind of became seamless.
yeah.
Um, yeah, but that was really disturbing. That was one of those moments where because that skin suit was anatomically accurate,
Yeah.
and
You could feel it.
I'm filming that. I had filmed that myself. That was a handheld moment, and I'm in
Yeah.
there with this writhing, naked skin, and that was definitely one of those like, Marvel would never do this.
Yeah. Fuck no.
This was one of those moments where, yeah, this definitely ain't a Marvel movie.
And it's all the better for it. It's all the better for it. I'd hate myself for not asking. I know it's probably been asked every day since 2006. Is there any Crank 3 updates? Are you and Mark talking about it? Where I know there was a script or a story at one point. Where are we at with that? Just as a fan.
Yeah, no, I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I went back and watched the first one again last night, and I was just like, "Fuck! I got my hopes up. I got my hopes up real good."
Yeah, well, that's a whole, we could have an hour conversation just about that, but
I'm sure. I'm sure. But look,
probably
Brian,
probably for another time.
probably for another time. Look, like
Yeah.
I said, I really appreciate you taking the time. I am genuinely a fan of your work. I loved watching this film, and when the opportunity came up to talk to you, I couldn't say no. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being just like a formative part of my love for movies, man. Like I genuinely
Wow.
appreciate it. Like I love
I appreciate that.